On July 14, 1941, a song that the world had never heard before rang out over the Orcha railway station. It was not the voice of a singer, but the roar of rocket shells, the first combat salvo of the legendary Katyusha, a Soviet weapon that became a nightmare for enemies and a symbol of hope for defenders of the motherland. The story of the creation of a system that changed the nature of war and became legendary under the name of a simple Russian girl. Subscribe to our channel to learn more about the legendary weapons of World War II. And in the comments, let's discuss the controversial question: was the Katyusha really a revolutionary weapon or just a successful modernization of already known technologies? On July 14, 1941, at 7:15 in the morning, a sound that no one in the world had ever heard before rang out over the Orcha railway station. It was not the usual whistle of artillery shells or the roar of diving bombers. It was something new, incomprehensible, and therefore even more frightening. German soldiers who had captured an important railway junction heard a long howl, resembling both a cry and a song. Then the earth shook from explosions of unprecedented force. At that moment, few realized that they were witnesses to a historic event. For the first time in the world, a multiple rocket launcher was used in combat. It would soon be given the popular name Katyusha and become one of the symbols of victory in the Great Patriotic War. The battery was commanded by Captain Ivan Andreevich Flerov, a man whose name should stand alongside those of the great military leaders, but who remained in the shadows for a long time due to the secrecy surrounding the weapon. The effect of the first salvo exceeded all expectations. 7 BM-13 combat vehicles fired 112 M-13 rockets. The railway station was reduced to smoldering ruins. German trains carrying ammunition and fuel exploded one after another. Panic gripped the enemy. No one understood where this hurricane of fire had come from. The familiar sounds of war, machine gun fire, mine explosions, and the rumble of tanks faded before this cacophony of destruction. But the most important effect of the Katyushas was not so much physical as psychological. The characteristic whistling of shells flying in a curved trajectory created a sense of inevitability in the enemy. It was impossible to understand where the fire was coming from. Impossible to hide from the shells that fell from the sky like divine punishment. The Germans nicknamed the new weapon Stalin's organ because of this howling sound, reminiscent of organ music. After the volley, Flerov's battery quickly withdrew and left its firing positions. This was another feature of the new weapon, its high mobility. By the time the enemy tried to locate the position and launch a counterattack, the Katyushas were already several kilometers away from the firing site. This hit-and-run tactic would become the hallmark of rocket artillery throughout the war. News of the unusual weapon spread instantly across the front. Soldiers told each other about the mysterious installations that sang before unleashing a fiery tornado on the enemy. The first legends and tales began to appear. Some claimed to have seen the shells flying in formation, like cranes in the sky. Others swore that they heard the melody of the famous song Katyusha in their roar. Thus was born the myth of a weapon that sang songs of death to its enemies and songs of hope to its defenders. The history of Katyusha began long before that July morning in 1941. Its roots go back to the 1920s, when Soviet scientists and designers began work on jet weapons. In those days, such research seemed like science fiction. But it was then that the foundations were laid for future triumph. In 1921, a laboratory for the development of rocket engines was established in the Soviet Union. It was headed by Nikolai Ivanovich Tikhomirov, an enthusiastic man who believed in the future of jet technology. The laboratory was given the mysterious name Gas Dynamics Laboratory, GDL. Behind these modest letters lay ambitious plans to create a fundamentally new weapon. The first experiments were more than modest. Small rockets took off for several dozen meters and fell, often without even reaching their target. But each failure brought new knowledge. Designers studied various types of fuel, experimented with the shape of nozzles, and searched for the optimal body design. Work progressed slowly. Funds were scarce, but the researchers' enthusiasm did not wane. By the early 1930s, it became clear that jet projectiles could become a serious weapon. The Soviet military leadership took notice of the work being done at the GDLA. In 1932, the laboratory was transformed into the Jet Research Institute (RNI). Funding increased, the staff expanded, and new experimental facilities appeared. In parallel with state developments, enthusiasts created public organizations. The Jet Propulsion Study Group, GERD, brought together young engineers and students who were fascinated by the idea of spaceflight and the creation of rocket weapons. This organization included future luminaries of Soviet rocket technology, including Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. The first major success was the RS-82 rocket, created in 1933. This 82mm caliber rocket could hit targets at a distance of up to 5 kilometers. Tests showed the promise of this direction, but also revealed serious problems. Firing accuracy was low, and reliability was insufficient. Years of painstaking work were required to create an effective weapon. Boris Sergeyevich Petropavlovsky became a key figure in the development. This talented engineer managed to solve many technical problems. He developed a new design for the jet engine, improved the aerodynamics of the projectile, and created an effective stabilization system. Under his leadership, by the end of the 1930s, a projectile was ready that would become the basis for the Katyusha, the M13. Meanwhile, designers were working not only on the projectile, but also on the launcher. Initially, it was planned to use stationary positions, but the military demanded mobility. A launcher was needed that could quickly take up position, fire a salvo, and immediately leave the firing position. This task proved to be no less difficult than creating the projectile itself. Among the names associated with the creation of the Katyusha, Andrei Grigorievich Kostikov occupies a special place. It was this man who led the final stage of the system's development and brought it to serial production. However, the road to success was thorny and full of dramatic twists and turns. Kostikov was born in 1892 into the family of a railway worker. From childhood, he showed an interest in technology and dreamed of becoming an engineer. After the revolution, he entered the Petrograd Polytechnic Institute, where he studied mechanics and ballistics. Even then, the young student was attracted to unconventional technical solutions and promising areas of weapons development. In the 1920s, Kostikov worked at various defense enterprises, gaining experience in the field of artillery systems. He was noticed as a talented engineer, ready to take on complex tasks. When specialists were needed to work on jet weapons in the early 1930s, Kostikov was invited to join the Russian Research Institute of Jet Propulsion, RNII. The first years at the institute were difficult. The team consisted of bright individuals, each of whom defended their own technical solutions. Disputes sometimes turned into conflicts, and projects were revised several times. Kostakov proved himself not only a talented designer, but also a skilled organizer, capable of uniting the efforts of different specialists. By the end of the 1930s, it became clear that work on jet weapons needed new leadership. Many pioneers either switched to other projects or fell victim to repression. In 1938, Kostakov was appointed chief designer of jet systems. He was tasked with creating a combat-ready weapon in the shortest possible time. Kostakov understood that time was against them. The international situation was heating up, and war seemed inevitable. It was necessary not only to create an effective projectile, but also to develop the entire system: the launch device, guidance systems, and tactics for use. Every month of delay could cost the country dearly. Under Kostakov's leadership, a close-knit team of designers was formed. It included Vladimir Andreevich Artemyev, a specialist in powder charges, Leonid Emanuilovich Schwartz, an expert in aerodynamics, and Nikolai Sergeyevich Streltsky, a developer of launchers. Each was responsible for their own area of work, but everyone understood the overall goal. Kostakov worked particularly closely with Vladimir Abramovich Artemyev. This young engineer had an amazing intuition for ballistics and powder compositions. It was Artemyev who suggested using a special type of smokeless powder for the M13 projectile, which ensured stable thrust throughout the entire flight. Without this technical solution, the Katyusha would never have achieved such effectiveness. Kostakov demanded maximum performance from his subordinates, but he himself worked 16 hours a day. He personally participated in tests, made adjustments to the design, and resolved production issues. Colleagues recalled that the chief designer could arrive at the factory in the middle of the night if there were problems with the manufacture of the next batch of shells. The heart of the Katyusha system was the M13 rocket. This 132mm caliber projectile was the result of many years of work by Soviet designers and embodied the most advanced technical solutions of its time. At first glance, the shell looked simple, a metal cylinder with 4 stabilizers. But behind this simplicity lay complex engineering. The projectile was 1 meter 400 millimeters long and weighed 42.5 kilograms. Of this, 21 kilograms were accounted for by the warhead, with the remaining weight distributed between the rocket engine and the body. This ratio ensured an optimal balance between destructive power and flight range. The warhead contained 4.8 kilograms of ammonium nitrate explosive. This was enough to destroy manpower and light fortifications within a radius of up to 30 meters from the point of detonation. The shell's fragmentation effect was particularly effective against infantry in open terrain. When hitting a building, the projectile could destroy a brick wall up to half a meter thick. The projectile's jet engine ran on a special type of smoky gunpowder. The gunpowder was compressed into 7 checkers, which were placed in the rear of the projectile. When ignited, the sticks burned sequentially, providing constant thrust throughout the entire operation of the engine. The operation time was 1/10 of a second, during which the projectile accelerated to a speed of 355 meters per second. A distinctive feature of the design was the location of the nozzles. Unlike conventional rockets, where the nozzle is located in the center of the rear section, the M13 had 20 nozzles located at an angle to the projectile axis. This arrangement not only provided thrust, but also imparted a rotational motion to the projectile, which increased flight stability. The projectile was stabilized in flight by 4 folding stabilizers. In the stowed position, they were folded along the body, and after the projectile left the guides, they opened under the action of centrifugal force. Each stabilizer was a metal plate with a carefully calculated shape and dimensions. The designers worked long and hard on the shape of the stabilizers. Initially, they were rectangular, but tests showed that this shape created excessive aerodynamic drag. After numerous experiments, a trapezoidal shape with rounded corners was chosen. This solution provided the optimal combination of stability and flight range. The ignition system was as simple and reliable as possible. When fired, an electric impulse ignited a pyrotechnic composition, which in turn ignited the main charge. The entire system fired in a fraction of a second, allowing volleys to be fired with minimal intervals between shots. The maximum firing range of the M13 projectile was 8,400 meters. At this distance, the dispersion was significant, but for a salvo fire system, this was actually an advantage, as it increased the area of destruction. The optimal range was considered to be 3,000 to 5,000 meters, which provided the best combination of accuracy and effectiveness. The path from experimental prototype to serial production was long and arduous. Testing of the M13 projectile and the BM13 launcher began in 1939 and continued until the outbreak of war. Each test revealed new problems that required immediate solutions. The first tests were conducted at a test site near Leningrad. A trial batch of 20 shells was manufactured at the Kliment Voroshilov factory. The designers eagerly awaited the results, as the fate of the entire project depended on them. However, the first test firings were disappointing. Only 12 of the 20 shells reached their target, while the rest exploded in the air or fell short of the target range. Analysis of the failures revealed numerous shortcomings. The gunpowder burned unevenly, creating pulsating thrust. The stabilizers did not open synchronously, which led to a loss of stability. The ignition system was unreliable, especially at low temperatures. The designers had a lot of painstaking work ahead of them to eliminate all the identified defects. The launch pad caused particularly many problems. Initially, the guides were made of wood covered with iron. This design was cheap and lightweight, but could not withstand the stress of firing. After several volleys, the guides deformed and accuracy dropped sharply. It was necessary to switch to all-metal guides, which increased the weight of the launcher but provided the necessary strength. The guidance system also became a serious problem. The first models had only mechanical drives, which made aiming slow and inaccurate. The military demanded that the battery be able to turn around, take aim, and open fire within a few minutes. The designers developed a quick aiming system, but it required highly skilled operators. Winter tests in 1939 to 1940 revealed new difficulties. At temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius, the gunpowder burned poorly, and the shells did not reach their calculated velocity. Metal parts became brittle and often broke during firing. The electrical ignition system malfunctioned due to increased wire resistance. To solve the problem of frost resistance, special additives were developed for the gunpowder. The insulation of the electrical circuits was improved, and a preheating system was introduced before firing. These measures ensured the reliable operation of the Katyusha in all climatic conditions. Tactical exercises were conducted in parallel with technical tests. The military studied the optimal ways to use the new weapon. Initially, the Katyushas were planned to be used as conventional artillery to support infantry and destroy fortifications. However, it soon became clear that the main advantage of the system was not the accuracy of individual shots, but the ability to quickly unleash massive fire on the enemy. By the spring of 1941, the tests were largely complete. The system was officially designated BM-13 Combat Vehicle on a ZIS-6 chassis. The military accepted the design, and a decision was made to begin mass production. The first experimental battery was being prepared for shipment to the troops, but no one suspected that it would see combat within a few months. The top secret stamp accompanied the Katyusha project from the very beginning. The Soviet leadership was well aware of the strategic importance of the new weapon and took unprecedented measures to keep it secret. The secrecy regime was so strict that even many high-ranking military commanders were unaware of the existence of rocket artillery. All documents related to the project had code names. The M13 shell was referred to in correspondence as Product 31A, and the BM13 launcher was called Product 209. Even in secret reports, direct names were avoided, using vague phrases such as special weapon or special purpose system. Such precautions were justified. In the pre-war years, Soviet intelligence constantly reported attempts by foreign special services to obtain information about new types of weapons. Production of the first serial models was organized at the compressor plant in Moscow. This enterprise was not chosen by chance. It already had experience in manufacturing secret military equipment and had the necessary production facilities. The plant's director, Vladimir Pavlovich Barmin, received personal instructions from Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin to organize production as quickly as possible. Workers involved in the production of the Katyusha underwent special security checks. They were forbidden to discuss their work even with family members. A separate closed area was created at the plant, where only persons with special passes were allowed. Finished products were transported under cover of darkness in closed trucks. In parallel with the main production, spare capacity was created at factories in Rudny, Omsk, and Novosibirsk. This decision proved to be far-sighted. After the war began, the Moscow factory had to be evacuated, and production was quickly ramped up at other enterprises. By June 1941, 36 BM-13 launchers had been manufactured. Special precautions were taken when transporting the finished products. The Katyushas were transported in disassembled form, with the guides separate from the chassis and the shells transported separately. Assembly was carried out only in specially equipped workshops, directly in the troops. Even experienced military mechanics did not always understand what kind of weapon they were assembling. The formation of the first rocket artillery batteries began in May 1941. Personnel were selected with particular care. Preference was given to career military personnel with higher education and experience in the artillery. Each candidate underwent an interview in a special department and signed a non-disclosure agreement. Captain Ivan Andreevich Flerov was appointed commander of the first battery. This 35-year-old officer graduated from the Leningrad Military Artillery Academy, served in the Far East, and participated in the battles at Lake Khasan. Flerov was distinguished not only by his professionalism, but also by his personal bravery and ability to make decisions in difficult conditions. The personnel were trained at a secret training ground near Moscow. The soldiers studied the design of the new weapons, mastered the tactics of their use, and practiced coordination within the battery. Particular attention was paid to the speed of deployment and withdrawal from positions, as this determined the unit's survivability in combat. The first live-fire exercises made a stunning impression even on experienced artillerymen. The simultaneous launch of 16 shells created a wall of fire of unprecedented power. The earth shook from the explosions, and the air was filled with smoke and dust. Observers noted that the psychological effect of a Katyusha salvo was comparable to that of a large air raid. By the beginning of the war, 7 rocket artillery batteries had been formed, with a total of 42 launchers. The batteries were given the code name Captain Flerov's batteries, after the commander of the first unit. This was done to conceal the true number of the new weapons and mislead the enemy about their capabilities. The morning of July 14, 1941, forever changed the nature of the war. Captain Flerov's battery received orders to advance to the Orcha railway station and strike at a concentration of German troops. This was the first combat mission for the new weapon, and no one could predict the outcome. The battery consisted of 7 BM-13 combat vehicles on ZIS-6 chassis. Each vehicle carried 16 launchers for M13 rocket shells. The battery's total ammunition load was 112 shells, which was not much by conventional artillery standards, but the destructive power of a salvo compensated for the relatively small amount of ammunition. Reconnaissance reported that large enemy forces were concentrated at the Orcha station. German troops used the railway junction to regroup and supply advancing units. There were trains loaded with tanks, artillery, ammunition, and fuel on the tracks. Destroying this concentration could seriously hamper the enemy's advance towards Moscow. The battery advanced towards its target under cover of darkness. They moved without turning on their headlights, navigating by the stars and local landmarks. Flerov personally conducted reconnaissance and selected positions for each vehicle. The main requirement was secrecy. The enemy must not discover the preparations for the strike until the last moment. The firing positions were taken 4 kilometers from the target. The distance was chosen to be optimal. The M13 shells retained sufficient accuracy at this range, and the battery was outside the effective range of German artillery. The vehicles were arranged in a fan formation to provide maximum coverage of the target and make it difficult for the enemy to determine their positions. Preparations for firing took 20 minutes. The crews accurately aimed the guns at the target, checked the electrical circuits, and loaded the shells into the launchers. Flerov once again checked the firing data, contacted the observation post, and gave the order to prepare for the salvo. The tension reached its peak. Everyone understood the historical significance of the moment. At 7:15 a.m., the command "Fire" was given. Senior Lieutenant Shchukin's machine fired first. The rocket projectile shot into the sky with a characteristic whine, leaving a smoky trail behind it. A second later, the rest of the shots followed. Fiery trails cut through the sky, and the earth shook from the roar of the launching rockets. The entire volley lasted less than 10 seconds. 112 shells rushed toward their target, creating a veritable rain of fire in the air. Flerov and his fighters held their breath, watching the shells fly. Half a minute later, the first explosions flashed over the Orcha station. One after another, the rockets burst, turning the railway junction into a burning hell. The effect exceeded even the wildest expectations. German trains exploded and burned, spreading the fire to neighboring trains. Ammunition depots detonated with a deafening roar, throwing debris hundreds of meters away. Panic gripped the enemy. No one understood where this hurricane of fire had come from. Radio intercepts recorded the confused reports of German commanders trying to understand the nature of the new weapon. 5 minutes after the salvo, Flerov's battery was already leaving its firing positions. The combat vehicles quickly turned around and moved to reserve positions. When the German artillery returned fire, the Katyushas were already several kilometers away from the firing point. This was the first time the hit-and-run tactic had been used, which became the hallmark of rocket artillery. The psychological impact of the Katyusha on the enemy became one of its main advantages. German soldiers who had fought in Poland and France were accustomed to the sounds of war, the roar of artillery, the screech of dive bombers, the crackle of machine guns. But the sound of rocket shells was something fundamentally new, unfamiliar, and therefore even more frightening. The characteristic sound of the M13 shells was due to their design. 20 jet nozzles, positioned at an angle to the axis of the shell, created turbulent gas flows which, when interacting with the air, produced a long, drawn-out howl. This sound could be heard at a distance of up to 10 kilometers and served as a kind of calling card for Soviet weapons. German prisoners of war later recounted that the sound of approaching Katyushas caused them to panic. Unlike artillery shells, which fly along a flat trajectory and allow for cover, rocket shells fell almost vertically from the sky. It was almost impossible to hide from them. They hit any cover except the deepest. A massive volley from a Katyusha battery created the effect of a continuous rain of fire. 112 shells fired in 10 seconds covered an area of up to a hectare. The density of fire was so high that it was almost impossible to survive in the strike zone. Even those who remained physically unharmed suffered severe psychological shock. The German command quickly realized the danger of the new weapon and tried to find an antidote. Special instructions were issued on how to protect against Stalin's organs, as the Wehrmacht dubbed the Soviet rocket systems. Soldiers were advised to lie down immediately when they heard the whistling sound, cover their heads, seek shelter in sturdy structures, and spread out over the area. However, all these measures had only a limited effect. The main problem was that the Katyushas did not strike individual targets, but rather large areas. Even if individual soldiers took cover, the overall combat effectiveness of the unit dropped sharply. Communications and command were disrupted. Panic ensued, and people lost their ability to organize resistance. The Katyushas had a particularly strong impact on the enemy's rear units. German convoys, warehouses, and headquarters did not expect a rocket artillery strike and did not have adequate shelters. A single salvo from a battery could completely paralyze the work of a large rear hub, disrupt the supply of an entire division, and knock out the communications and command system. The propaganda effect of the Katyusha was no less important than its combat effectiveness. Soviet troops perceived the new weapon as a symbol of technical superiority over the enemy, proof of the Red Army's ability to give a worthy rebuff to the aggressor. The characteristic roar of the shells raised the morale of Soviet soldiers and at the same time demoralized the enemy. German propaganda tried to belittle the significance of Stalin's organs, calling them inaccurate weapons for barbarians. It was claimed that the cultured German army preferred precision strikes with aimed fire rather than barbaric carpet bombing. However, these statements could not hide the growing fear of the new Soviet weapon. Gradually, rocket artillery became shrouded in legends on both sides of the front. Soviet soldiers told of a miracle weapon that could blow any enemy fortifications to smithereens. The Germans passed on terrifying stories about mysterious installations that appeared out of nowhere, unleashed a fiery tornado, and disappeared without a trace. Thus was born the myth of the Katyusha, a weapon that frightened with its song. The success of the Katyusha's first combat use near Orcha prompted the Soviet command to accelerate the development of rocket artillery. Already in August 1941, work began on new modifications to the system. Designers worked in several directions at once, increasing the firing range, increasing the power of the warhead, and creating more mobile installations. The first major upgrade was the creation of the M20 shell. This 132mm caliber rocket was longer than its predecessor and carried a larger explosive charge. The firing range increased to 11,000 kilometers, and the warhead weight increased to 18 kilograms. The new shell was significantly more effective, but also more difficult to manufacture. At the same time, work was underway on large-caliber systems. In October 1941, the 300mm M30 projectile entered testing. This giant, weighing 92 kilograms, carried a warhead weighing 28 kilograms and could hit targets at a range of up to 12,000 meters. The destructive power of such a shell was truly monstrous. New launchers were needed to fire large-caliber shells. The BM-30 system was created on the basis of the ZIS-6 truck. The launcher carried 4 guides for M30 shells, which was significantly less than the BM-13, but this was compensated for by the power of the ammunition. The destructive effect of a BM-30 salvo exceeded that of an entire artillery battery. Special attention was paid to the creation of light rocket systems to support the infantry. An 82mm caliber M8 projectile was developed for firing from light portable mounts. Such a system could be delivered to the front line by an infantry squad and provide fire support in critical situations. Designers also experimented with high-powered multi-barrel installations. An experimental BM-48 system was created, carrying 48 guides for M13 shells. Such a system could fire almost 3 combat loads of a conventional battery in a single volley, but proved too heavy and unwieldy for combat use. A serious problem was ensuring that the troops had enough ammunition. The production of rocket shells required special equipment and skilled personnel. In wartime conditions, it was necessary to quickly master new technologies, train workers, and establish mass production. By the end of 1941, monthly production of rockets had reached 50,000. An important area of development was improving firing accuracy. Initially, the Katyushas were considered exclusively as weapons of mass destruction, but the military demanded the ability to accurately hit individual targets. An improved stabilization system was developed, the aerodynamics of the shells were improved, and more accurate sighting devices were created. Designers also worked on increasing the rate of fire of the installations. Initially, reloading the BM-13 took about an hour, which made the system vulnerable to counter-battery fire. Cassette containers were developed, reducing reloading time to 20 minutes. This significantly increased the combat effectiveness of rocket artillery. By the beginning of 1942, Soviet rocket artillery was no longer a series of experimental models, but a developed system of weapons for various purposes. From light portable installations to powerful multi-barrel systems, each type had its place in the overall system of firepower against the enemy. By the spring of 1942, the production of Katyushas had become widespread. Despite the harsh conditions of wartime and the evacuation of many enterprises to the east, Soviet industry managed to establish serial production of rocket systems. More than 300 launchers of various types rolled off the assembly lines every month. The main manufacturer remained the Vladimir Lenin plant in Moscow, which had been evacuated from the capital to Omsk. Despite the difficulties of relocation, the plant resumed full production just 2 months after the evacuation. The plant's director, Sergei Alexandrovich Akopov, organized work on a continuous cycle basis. The machines did not stop for a minute. Dozens of enterprises throughout the Soviet Union joined in the production of Katyushas. The Krasnoye Sormovo plant in Gorky produced chassis for launchers. Enterprises in the Urals produced guides and guidance mechanisms, and factories in Siberia manufactured ammunition. A cooperative of hundreds of enterprises united by a common goal was created. Particular attention was paid to product quality. Each launch pad underwent strict control, and each shell was tested for compliance with technical requirements. Defects were unacceptable. The lives of Soviet soldiers and the outcome of battles depended on the quality of the weapons. The workers understood their responsibility and worked with complete dedication. Mass production required simplification of the design. Designers revised many technical solutions, replaced scarce materials with more accessible ones, and optimized technological processes. A simplified modification of the BM-1316 with wooden guides was created, which, while maintaining its combat characteristics, was significantly cheaper. A serious problem was the shortage of automobile chassis. ZS-6 trucks were needed not only for the Katyushas, but also for other military purposes. Designers developed installations based on tractors, railway platforms, and even sleds for winter conditions. The main thing was to ensure mobility and rapid deployment. Training personnel to service the rocket artillery was carried out at an accelerated pace. Special courses were created at artillery schools, where officers studied the features of the new weapons. Sergeants and privates were trained directly in their units under the guidance of instructors who had undergone training at the manufacturing plants. By the summer of 1942, the Red Army already had more than 500 launchers of various types. They were organized into rocket artillery regiments, which were assigned to armies and fronts to perform the most important tasks. Each regiment included 3 divisions with 3 batteries each, for a total of 36 launchers. The combat use of the Katyushas became increasingly widespread and varied. They were used to suppress enemy artillery positions, destroy fortifications, and defeat concentrations of manpower and equipment. Night strikes against enemy rear targets, railway stations, warehouses, and airfields proved particularly effective. The tactics of using rocket artillery were constantly being improved. Commanders learned to concentrate the fire of several batteries to deliver particularly powerful strikes, and developed methods of cooperation with aircraft and tanks. The Katyushas became an integral part of the Soviet firepower system, and one of the main factors that ensured the turning point in the war. The German command was forced to revise its tactics to take into account the threat posed by Soviet rocket artillery. Troops began to pay more attention to dispersal, camouflage, and the creation of shelters. However, it was never possible to completely neutralize the impact of the Katyushas. Their firepower and suddenness of deployment were too great. The Katyushas saw combat on all fronts of the Great Patriotic War, from the Arctic tundra to the steppes of the Kuban, from the walls of Leningrad to the banks of the Volga. Soviet rocket systems struck terror into the hearts of the enemy and instilled hope in the hearts of the defenders of the motherland. Each front had its own characteristics for using the new weapon. On the Leningrad front, the Katyushas became a real salvation for the besieged city. Under blockade conditions, when every shell was worth its weight in gold, rocket artillery allowed powerful strikes to be delivered with relatively little ammunition. The batteries were located deep in the defense and could quickly hit any target on the front line. The Katyushas proved particularly effective in repelling German assaults. When enemy infantry launched an attack, a volley of rocket artillery instantly stopped the advance. German soldiers, accustomed to systematic artillery preparation, did not expect a sudden firestorm and retreated in panic to their starting positions. On the Moscow front, the Katyushas were used for counter-battery fire for the first time. Reconnaissance spotted the positions of German guns, and rocket systems delivered concentrated strikes against them. The high density of fire made it possible to suppress entire enemy artillery groups, depriving them of the ability to provide fire support to the advancing troops. The Battle of Moscow was the moment of glory for rocket artillery. In December 1941, when the Red Army launched a counter-offensive, Katyushas rained down on retreating German columns. Snow-covered roads were turned into a graveyard of burned-out vehicles and dead enemy soldiers. On the Stalingrad front, rocket artillery proved its effectiveness in street fighting. German troops entrenched in stone buildings seemed invulnerable to conventional artillery. But the Katyushas could destroy entire neighborhoods, reducing enemy fortifications to piles of rubble. A volley from a BM-13 battery completely destroyed a 3-story brick building. The Katyushas played a special role in the preparation of Operation Uranus, the encirclement of German troops near Stalingrad. Massive strikes by rocket artillery suppressed the enemy's defense system, disrupted troop control, and created chaos in the enemy's ranks. This ensured the success of the Soviet Tank Corps' breakthrough. At the Kursk Bulge, Katyushas participated in the largest artillery battle of the war. The Soviet command concentrated hundreds of rocket launchers here, which struck the starting positions of German troops. Before the start of Operation Citadel, BM-13 batteries rained thousands of shells on concentrations of enemy tanks and infantry. The effectiveness of the Katyushas in the defensive battle near Kursk was exceptionally high. After their capture, German tankers said that it was not anti-tank guns that frightened them most, but rocket systems. A salvo from a Katyusha battery could stop an entire tank company, showering it with shrapnel and causing psychological shock to the crews. In the offensive operations of 1943 to 1944, the Katyushas became an integral part of artillery preparation. Their strikes on enemy strongholds preceded infantry and tank attacks. Their high mobility allowed the rocket systems to quickly move behind the advancing troops and provide continuous support. In the final stage of the war, Katyushas stormed the fortifications of the Eastern Wall, crushed German garrisons in the Baltic states, and participated in the liberation of Poland and the capture of Berlin. Everywhere they confirmed their reputation as a formidable and effective weapon capable of solving the most complex combat tasks. The tactics of using the Katyushas differed radically from those of conventional artillery. The rocket systems required special combat techniques that took into account their specific characteristics: high firepower but relatively low accuracy, exceptional mobility, and vulnerability in their positions. The main principle of using the Katyusha was to concentrate fire in time and space. Unlike barrel artillery, which could fire continuously for long periods, rocket systems delivered a short but extremely powerful strike. The entire battery's ammunition was fired in a few minutes, after which the launchers immediately left their positions. The classic combat scenario was as follows: stealthy advance to firing positions, rapid deployment, a sudden massive volley, and immediate retreat to reserve positions. The entire cycle from deployment to withdrawal took no more than 30 minutes, making the battery virtually invulnerable to return fire. the choice of firing positions was of critical importance. The position had to ensure stealthy occupation and rapid withdrawal, have convenient access roads, and good camouflage conditions. Preference was given to wooded areas, ravines, and folds in the terrain. Open positions were avoided due to the high vulnerability of the installations. The firing range determined the depth of the firing positions. BM-13s with a maximum range of 8,400 meters were located 4 to 6 kilometers from the front line. This ensured safety from enemy artillery fire and, at the same time, allowed targets deep in enemy defenses to be hit. The Katyushas were aimed at areas rather than individual targets. A typical task was to suppress a strongpoint, destroy concentrations of manpower, and destroy defensive structures in a specific area. The accuracy of a single shot was low, but a battery salvo was guaranteed to hit everything in a given square. Nighttime Katyusha strikes were particularly effective. In the darkness, the flashes of the launches were visible from a great distance, creating an additional psychological effect. The enemy could not accurately determine the number and location of the firing installations, which caused panic and exaggerated estimates of losses. Interaction with other branches of the armed forces required careful coordination. The Katyushas supported infantry and tank attacks, suppressed enemy firing points, and covered the retreat of their own troops. Interaction with intelligence was particularly important. Only accurate data on targets allowed for the effective use of limited ammunition. By the middle of the war, it had become common practice to concentrate Katyushas to deliver particularly powerful strikes. Several batteries simultaneously rained fire on key enemy targets, such as headquarters, communications centers, and artillery positions. Such strikes had a devastating effect and put entire sections of the defense out of action for long periods of time. Counter-battery warfare became one of the most important areas of application for rocket artillery. Katyushas could quickly suppress detected enemy batteries, depriving them of fire support. The high density of fire compensated for the lack of accuracy. Even if they missed, the shrapnel from the shells would hit the crews and damage the guns. By the end of the war, the tactics of using Katyushas had reached a high level of perfection. Commanders learned to maximize the advantages of rocket artillery and neutralize its disadvantages. Katyushas became a formidable weapon, capable of solving a wide range of combat tasks and ensuring the success of offensive operations. The German command quickly realized the seriousness of the threat posed by Soviet rocket artillery. Already in August 1941, the first instructions on countering Stalin's organs appeared in the Wehrmacht headquarters. Combating the Katyushas became one of the priority tasks of the German troops on the Eastern Front. Initially, the Germans tried to use traditional counter-battery methods. Artillery reconnaissance detected flashes from launches and coordinated return fire at the presumed positions. However, the high mobility of the Katyushas made these attempts virtually futile. By the time the shells arrived, the positions were already empty. The use of aviation to combat rocket systems proved more effective. German pilots patrolled areas where Soviet troops were located, trying to spot Katyushas on the march or in areas of concentration. However, Soviet batteries quickly mastered anti-aircraft defense and camouflage techniques, which significantly reduced the effectiveness of air attacks. German intelligence made enormous efforts to obtain information about Soviet rocket artillery. Agents were tasked with finding out the location of manufacturing plants, the technical characteristics of the systems, and the tactics of their use. However, strict secrecy and the vigilance of the Soviet security services thwarted most of these attempts. Attempts to capture Katyusha samples for study remained unsuccessful for a long time. Soviet crews were given strict orders to blow up their installations if they were threatened with capture. Captain Flerov and his battery died in October 1941 while carrying out this order, blowing up their vehicles so that they would not fall into enemy hands. It was not until the spring of 1942 that the Germans managed to capture several damaged BM-13 installations and samples of M13 shells. The trophies were immediately sent to Germany for detailed study. German experts were amazed by the simplicity and effectiveness of the Soviet designs. Based on their study of the trophies, the Germans attempted to create their own rocket systems. The Nebelwerfer 41 was developed, which resembled the Soviet Katyusha. However, the German system was significantly inferior to the Soviet one in terms of its main characteristics: range, salvo power, and ease of manufacture and operation. German designers chose to complicate the design in an effort to improve firing accuracy. Their shells had a complex stabilization system, precise guidance devices, and high-quality materials. But this made the weapons expensive, difficult to manufacture, and demanding on the qualifications of the maintenance personnel. Psychological warfare against the impact of the Katyushas was waged through a system of propaganda and training. German soldiers were told that Soviet rocket systems were weapons for barbarians, inaccurate and ineffective. It was claimed that the cultured German army had no need for such primitive means of warfare. Special tactical techniques were developed to defend against Katyusha strikes. Troops were advised to spread out as much as possible, create deeply echeloned defenses, and build strong shelters. However, all these measures only partially reduced the effectiveness of Soviet rocket artillery. It was not possible to neutralize it completely. The Katyusha strikes on rear targets were particularly painful for the Germans. Railway stations, warehouses, airfields, headquarters, all these targets were extremely vulnerable to rocket artillery. The German command had to allocate significant forces to protect rear communications, which weakened frontline units. By the end of the war, the Germans had still not found an effective countermeasure against the Katyushas. Soviet rocket artillery retained its significance as a formidable weapon until the last days of the war. The characteristic roar of the M13 shells rang out over Berlin in May 1945, reminding everyone that retribution had caught up with the aggressors. Victory in the Great Patriotic War did not mean the end of the Katyusha. Soviet rocket artillery underwent a long period of post-war development, modernization, and spread throughout the world. The system created in the pre-war years proved so successful that its descendants are still in service in many armies around the world. Immediately after the war, a thorough modernization of rocket systems began. Designers with extensive combat experience set about creating fundamentally new models. Firing accuracy was significantly improved, range was increased, and the power of the warheads was increased. Systems with feathered rocket projectiles appeared, providing significantly better fire concentration. In the 1950s, the BM-21 Grad system entered service, becoming the direct successor to the Katyusha. The new 122mm caliber system had a firing range of up to 20,000 meters and 40 guides instead of 16 on the BM-13. Firing accuracy was increased several times thanks to improved projectile stabilization. The Soviet Union actively exported rocket systems to friendly countries. Katyushas were supplied to China, North Korea, Vietnam, Arab states, and Warsaw Pact countries. Along with the weapons, production technology was also transferred, which allowed many countries to establish their own production of rocket systems. The People's Republic of China became one of the largest producers and consumers of Katyusha-type systems. Chinese designers created many modifications of Soviet models, adapted to local conditions and requirements. Chinese Katyushas participated in the Civil War, the Korean War, and border conflicts with neighboring states. Arab countries received significant quantities of Soviet rocket systems and actively used them in wars with Israel. Katyushas became a symbol of Arab resistance, with their volleys repeatedly reaching Israeli cities. Their ease of operation and high efficiency made these systems a favorite weapon of guerrilla and insurgent groups. During the Vietnam War, North Vietnamese troops widely used Katyusha-type systems against American bases and South Vietnamese positions. The jungle provided excellent camouflage for mobile installations, which could suddenly appear, strike, and disappear into the green thicket. The U.S. military recognized the high effectiveness of Vietnamese rocket artillery. African countries received Katyushas as part of Soviet military aid and used them in numerous local conflicts. From Angola to Ethiopia, from Mozambique to Algeria, Soviet rocket systems participated in wars of independence, civil conflicts, and border clashes. Their simplicity and reliability made them ideal weapons for African conditions. Latin American countries also gained access to Soviet technology. Cuban Katyushas were used to repel the Bay of Pigs invasion. Nicaraguan Katyushas were used in the fight against the Contras, and Angolan Katyushas were used in the Civil War. Everywhere, they confirmed their reputation as effective and affordable weapons. Gradually, rocket system production technology spread around the world. Many countries created their own modifications of the Katyusha, adapted to national needs. Systems of various calibers appeared, with different types of warheads and on different chassis. The principle laid down by Soviet designers proved to be universal. By the beginning of the 21st century, descendants of the Katyusha were in service in more than 50 countries around the world. From the simplest homemade installations of Lebanese guerrillas to the most complex systems of the Russian army, they all carried the genetic code laid down by the creators of the first Soviet rocket system. The Katyusha became one of the most widely used weapons in human history. Today, more than 8 decades after the first salvo near Orcha, the legacy of the Katyusha lives on. Modern Russian multiple-launch rocket systems such as the Smerch, Oregon, and Grad are direct descendants of the legendary BM-13. They have retained the basic principles of their ancestor: mobility, massive firepower, and ease of operation. The principles laid down by the creators of the Katyusha proved so sound that they remain relevant even in the era of high-precision weapons. Modern rocket systems are equipped with satellite navigation, computerized fire control systems, and high-precision ammunition. However, the basis remains unchanged: the ability to quickly concentrate powerful fire on a given area. Monuments to the Katyusha and its creators have been erected in many countries around the world. Russia has a museum of rocket artillery, where you can see examples of all modifications of the legendary system. Veterans of the Katyusha pass on to the younger generation the memory of the formidable weapon that helped bring victory closer. The names of the creators of the Katyusha are immortalized in the names of streets, schools, and industrial enterprises. Andrei Grigorievich Kostikov, Vladimir Andreevich Artemyev, and Ivan Andreevich Flerov have gone down in the history of Russian weaponry. Their creation became a symbol of the technical genius of Soviet designers and the unyielding will of the people to win. Modern conflicts confirm the relevance of the concept of rocket artillery. From Chechnya to Syria, from Ukraine to Nagorno-Karabakh, multiple launch rocket systems play an important role on the battlefield. Their ability to quickly suppress enemy manpower and firepower remains in demand in all conditions of modern warfare. The technologies first used in the Katyusha have found application not only in the military sphere. Reaction engines, stabilization systems, materials, and production technologies have all found use in cosmonautics, aviation, and civil industry. The path from military rocket to spacecraft turned out to be shorter than the creators of the first models could have imagined. The legend of Katyusha lives on in the popular imagination. The song Katyusha, which gave the weapon its name, remains one of the most popular in Russia. Its melody is heard at parades, concerts, and celebrations. It combines the image of a girl waiting for her beloved to return from war with that of a formidable weapon defending the motherland from its enemies. The international recognition of the Katyusha as an outstanding example of military technology is confirmed by its presence in museums around the world. From the Smithsonian Institution in Washington to the Imperial War Museum in London, the Soviet rocket system is presented everywhere as a revolutionary achievement of military thought. Modern Russian weapons designers continue the traditions of the creators of Katyusha. The latest Tornado G and Tornado S systems embody the latest achievements in science and technology, while remaining faithful to the basic principles of their predecessors. High mobility, powerful salvo, and rapid movement after firing remain defining characteristics. The influence of the Katyusha on the development of military art cannot be overestimated. It changed perceptions of the massive use of artillery, demonstrated the capabilities of a new class of weapons, and forced a rethink of combat tactics. Many principles first applied with the Katyushas have become classics and are still in use today. The history of the Katyusha is a story of the triumph of the human mind over the forces of evil. In the most difficult hour of trial, Soviet scientists and designers managed to create a weapon that became one of the factors in the victory. Their creation outlived its creators and continues to serve the cause of defending peace. Today, when the world is once again facing the threat of war, the experience of creating the Katyusha reminds us of the importance of technical superiority, the need for constant development of the defense industry, and the fact that freedom and independence must be reliably protected. The legendary Katyusha remains a symbol of this immutable truth. The song of the rocket shells, which first rang out over Orcha on July 14, 1941, echoes in the hearts of all who remember the lessons of history. Katyusha became more than just a weapon. It became a legend, a symbol of an unyielding will to victory, and a tribute to those who defended the freedom of the world.